All right, welcome Bears fans to another episode of Picks for Polls, a Chicago Bears draft podcast presented by the Bear Report and Blue Wire's Pods. Of course, my name is Andrew Freeman, happy to be your host today, and joining me today, of course, is my co-host Usayd Koshul. We're recording this episode on a Wednesday here, November 2nd, following a very, very busy trade deadline that occurred yesterday, especially for the Chicago Bears. And I don't know about you, Usayd, but this definitely felt like a much busier and chaotic trade deadline than we've seen in previous years in the NFL. And, honestly, I'm all here for it because it just makes the league more exciting. But before we dig into all the moves that the Bears made, and there were definitely some significant moves that we have to cover here today. How you doing today, man?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Obviously, exciting time. Had a lot of moves that were made. So, yeah, just excited to kind of get back into the grind of things and discuss it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's not bury the lead. Obviously, the Bears coming off a 49-29 loss to the Dallas Cowboys. We know what this team is, dropping to 3-5 in the season. I think, that leads us into a time where the Bears, rebuilding team, definitely looking to make some splashes here and some rebuilding moves to kind of get this team on track for to clear up some moves, get some draft picks, and clear up some cap space for next offseason. And that reflected itself in a very busy trade deadline for the Chicago Bears. So let's just recap all the moves that the Bears made here, because there were three key trades that the Bears made. When you're looking at before the trade deadline, before the Cowboys game even happened, the Bears traded away Robert Quinn to the Philadelphia Eagles for a fourth-round pick next year. In exchange for that, the Bears are eating pretty much all of Robert Quinn's salary. So the Eagles are basically getting Robert Quinn for a fourth-round pick and nothing on their cap sheet essentially for this year. Robert Quinn ended up cutting off the last couple of years of his contract. So he's one and done there in Philadelphia, helping them go on hopefully a Super Bowl run for the NFC leading Philadelphia Eagles. So Bears getting a fourth-round pick for Robert Quinn there. And then we get to the trade deadline yesterday, where there was a lot of intrigue on what the Bears could do at the trade deadline. Would they look to add a wide receiver? Would they look to trade away guys like David Montgomery, Roquan Smith, Eddie Jackson, some of these veteran guys from the last regime who may not be in the future plans for this Bears team under this new regime led by Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus? Well, we got that answer on one of those players, and that was Roquan Smith getting traded in a bit of a blockbuster to the Baltimore Ravens in exchange for a second-round pick next year, a fifth-round pick next year, as well as A.J. Klein, who's a linebacker coming over from the Ravens now in this trade as well. As part of that deal, the Bears are eating the rest of Roquan Smith's salary for this year as well on that fifth-year option. So very interesting move there. But if you thought the Bears were done just trading away players, well, they also were in the business of adding talent to this Bears team, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. When they made a trade later on in the day, trading away their second-round pick. So the Bears' own second-round pick, not the Baltimore Ravens' second-round pick, in exchange for Chase Claypool from the Pittsburgh Steelers, adding some talent to the wide receiver room. So there is obviously a lot to discuss here, Usayd. Let's start off with probably the smallest of these three trades. When we look at Robert Quinn, that deal to Philadelphia, I think this is probably the simplest one to explain here. So Usayd, I'll start with you, man. What are your thoughts on the Robert Quinn trade specifically, and how do you think that changes the outlook of everything for this Bears pass rush moving forward?
Yeah, it changes the outlook of the pass rush because, you're handing the keys over to Travis Gibson and Dominique Robinson. But then on the other hand, I think there's the other half of this, which is the fact that this was a widely expected move, right? And what I mean by that is that, you had heard trade rumors about Robert Quinn all throughout the summer, and then all of a sudden he's drawing that praise from Alan Williams, which the new defensive coordinator for the Bears. But the reality is that any defensive coordinator kind of in the NFL would have come out and said, Robert Quinn's a veteran leader, he's a team guy, he's a highly productive player, he's a player that you want in your locker room, he's a big culture guy. But I think the other major part of this is the fact that even if the Bears didn't trade him for a fourth round pick, he still would not have been on the roster next year, right? You're talking about a team that needs to get younger in every aspect. And I think that Quinn being 32, 33 years old wasn't necessarily someone who was ever in the future plan. So rather than cut him and save 13 million after June 1st next year, the Bears were like, hey, let's trade him, eat most of his salary, which is right around $7 million, and then we'll go ahead and we will, move on from Quinn, get the extra draft pick, to get someone who's going to be under control for 4 more years. And the key thing to keep in mind is, like, the Eagles are paying Quinn 700,000 this year, right? Which, if you look at in terms of like contract numbers, that's roughly the same amount you would be paying a fourth round pick on a rookie contract.
Yeah, I mean, the Philadelphia Eagles, it's simple for them, right? They want to add more depth to their pass rush. Robert Quinn, he's had a down year so far this year, but he's coming off a year where he just had 18 and a half sacks. So he definitely adds a lot of juice to that pass rush. I certainly hope nothing but the best for Robert Quinn moving forward this year. I hope he does end up, going on a run here for this Eagles team, because he's in a really good position where they can kind of use him as a situational guy. But from a Bears perspective here, I mean, you're right. This is a move that we were all expecting for the longest time. In fact, I know both you and I were questioning many times, both with our work at the Bear Report, on social media, and on this podcast, like, why haven't the Bears traded Robert Quinn earlier than this? Like, why didn't they decide to do this earlier in the offseason when his value may have been the highest? Did they risk, maybe dropping his value a little bit during the season when he did come off to a bit of a struggling start and wasn't the impact guy that we saw from him last year? And that's certainly a fair question, but I think it comes down to a couple things. Ryan Poles said in his statement to the media when explaining this trade that they wanted Robert Quinn here for the start of the rebuild because he was such a beloved locker room guy and a veteran presence. So from a locker room chemistry standpoint, I kind of get why they would want him to be here for training camp and the beginning of the season as they got this new regime started off a little bit. But there's also a salary cap reason for that as well when you look at it, where the Bears couldn't really trade him. I mean, they could have, but they would have been eating all the dead money had they traded him before June 1st. And by waiting till now, early in the season, later on in the season, that gave them more of an opportunity to eat Robert Quinn's salary to make it a little bit more appealing to an acquiring team. And it's just a simple fact that many teams probably weren't very interested in trading for Robert Quinn on that full contract, right? I think he's getting paid, or he was getting paid about, like, in terms of salary, about $12 million per year, which, you would think for Robert Quinn, if he's giving you the production that he was giving you last year, that's a bargain. But for this year, that's well above what he's playing at right now. Again, like I said, I think Robert Quinn, he's probably best off as a situational, rotational pass rusher type of guy, not as a full-time starter for you. And at that $12 million per year, $13 million per year, salary that he would have had, that's probably not going to be. Not a lot of teams would have been really interested in that, even though there wasn't any guaranteed money attached to it. So certainly there's a financial component to that, into that trade, and waiting on making that trade. I understand that. I think a deal could have been done a little bit earlier, probably. But in terms of, is this the best or worst case scenario for Robert Quinn trade? Like, I think this is probably the best case scenario in terms of return. Again, it's going to be a late fourth round pick that you're getting from the Eagles because they are a really good team. They're going to be near the top of the standings this year with how they're rolling right now. But again, it's like you said, you're trading away a veteran player who probably wasn't going to be here next year. He wasn't making an impact for this Bears team this year. And you're getting potentially a player that you're going to have, locked down for starting next year, the next 4 years, on a pretty cheap, reasonable rookie scale contract. And if he pans out, that gives you a really good value there. If not, I mean, you're looking at that extra fourth round pick. That's, good trade bait to use on day 3 of the draft to move back and get even more picks. We saw what Ryan Poles was able to do last year, trading back to get a bunch of day 3 picks, and how some of those turned out to be some solid players. And look at Braxton Jones, Dominique Robinson, getting some extra picks, dart throws at the offensive line on day 3, getting a punter on day 3 that, Trenton Guild, who's contributing right now. So we see the benefit of that, I think, with that approach. So I have no problem with it. I think expecting a day 2 pick for Robert Quinn is going to be rich anyway, even coming off the year last year, because the book is kind of out on Robert Quinn and what he is as a player. He's very streaky. He's kind of a one-trick pony at this stage in his career. He's not a good run defender. He's not a power rusher. He relies on guessing snap counts and using his speed and bend to win around the edge. And if he's not doing that, he really isn't offering you much. Now, in a limited role, that's very valuable. But as a full-time starter player, as a a guy who's expected to be an impact player for you, not much. So that's probably why the price wasn't a ton and why this deal didn't get done earlier. But they got a good return for Robert Quinn. And at the end of the day, now that that deal is done and they're no longer holding on to him, I'm satisfied with the way they've handled the Robert Quinn situation. I think if they would have held on to him, I would have been very annoyed with that situation in general. But they got something for him, and I think it's going to benefit this team moving forward here.
Yeah, you're right. It certainly will. I think the interesting part about all this is that, you kind of mentioned, right? He was by far the most experienced pass rusher on the team, but also it got to a point where there really wasn't necessarily like a future for him, but there was a role. There was a role because he was kind of the old head in the locker room, the most experienced guy, the oldest guy on the roster. But now, you look at it and it just made more sense for the Bears to move on and basically get pennies for him compared to holding on to him because, again, like the $13 million in cap space after June 1st next year, it's like it sounds great, but then it's a double-edged sword because you're trading him now, so you're getting the 4th round pick, which is far more valuable, I think, than having the extra $13 million in cap space. Which ultimately, knowing the way Poles operates, there's gonna be money left over next offseason sitting around that the Bears are gonna roll over into 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the cap ramifications of it, the Bears are saving a little bit this year, but in total, what it's doing is it's saving about $10 million towards their cap sheet next year. So here's what it comes down to for the Bears. For a veteran player who wasn't going to be on the team next year, who wasn't producing much for them this year, and who was eating up snaps for younger guys on the roster, such as Travis Gibson, Dominique Robinson, two guys that I think need the future a lot more over the course of the second half of the season moving forward as guys you want to develop at that edge spot. What they did was they used him to basically buy a 4th round pick for next year to kind of help kickstart this rebuild for their offseason next season. So that's the way I'm looking at it. It's a positive move for Ryan Poles. I really like what he did here to get that deal done. And I think it's what we wanted to see from him moving forward with this new regime. Trading off some of these older veteran defensive assets, cashing in those draft picks, saving a little bit of money for the future, and then hopefully reinvesting those resources on the offense. But speaking of moving off of defensive players here, defensive assets, let's talk about the big trade that went down that kind of divided, I think, a lot of people on Bears Twitter. It seemed like some Bears fans were all for this trade from the outset. And a lot of others were not because of the emotional attachment to this player. And that's trading away Roquan Smith for, like I said, 2nd round pick, a 5th round pick, and A.J. Klein from the Baltimore Ravens. Again, this is a move that I think, hearing Ryan Poles explain it, I think a lot of the points that he made a lot of sense where, contract negotiations did break down between the Bears and Roquan Smith this past offseason. We don't have to go over how that entire ordeal went down. And Ryan Poles basically said, for an off-ball linebacker, the sense that I'm getting is that Ryan Poles and this new regime just doesn't want to pay an off-ball linebacker the price that Roquan Smith was asking for, that $20 million per year AAV asking price with heavy guarantees involved with that. I just don't think this new regime wants to do that, especially at this stage of the rebuild. And Ryan Poles basically said, the franchise tag next year is going to be around $20 million. Not sure if that was something that we were really interested in. So, try to make it work through the first half of the season, see how he did with this new defensive scheme, new coaching staff. But, at the end of the day, I think this is probably the right move because if you weren't going to pay Roquan Smith, his best value to the organization is as a trade asset and getting some draft picks in return. And they got a significant draft haul here for Roquan Smith, a 2nd round pick, a day 3 pick here, and you're getting basically another body in there at linebacker to finish out the season. I'm not expecting much out of A.J. Klein. He's kind of just a throw-in for this trade. But I don't know. What were your thoughts on the trade? And just what were your thoughts on this one?
I mean, I wasn't surprised it happened, and here's why. Because I was at Hallis Hall the day that Roquan Smith had decided to return, and there were a lot of questions, I think, about how much money he was making, how much the Bears had offered, how negotiations went, how they broke down. And let me just say this: there's people out there on Bears Twitter who are talking about how polls shipped Roquan Smith off because once Roquan went public with the trade request, it was kind of bad mouthing the GM and the organization. And that, I think, is from top to bottom in every way completely false, because as a player you have every right to go public with your trade requests, right? It's just there's a difference in the sense that with Roquan Smith, you know, the trade request was made public by the player himself specifically because he doesn't have an agent, which again, him not having an agent's a totally separate story, because a lot of people fail to understand, like, you have your team on one side, you have your player on the other side, and you have your agent in the middle that's kind of bridging the gap between both guys, right? Or both sides, I should say. And ultimately, I think you have to look at the fit too, right? Roquan Smith is more of that like Patrick Willis type player in the sense that he was a perfect fit for what the Bears were doing under the 3-4 defense that they ran under Vic Fangio for so many years. And, you know, Vic Fangio and Chuck Pagano, they had their connections. And then Sean Desai kind of came up under Fangio. And so that was really the entire formula. But ultimately, the reality of the entire situation, I think, comes down to the fact that for the where the Bears were at, right, this was just something where you know, Ryan Poles once again knew, hey, I can either stick it out with this guy during the season, or I can go ahead and I can kind of ship him off and just call it a day and get the 2 picks in return. I think the Bears were more content with getting their 2 draft picks in return than they were with you know, riding it out and losing him via free agency, which quite frankly makes more sense anyway, because if you don't make the trade for Roquan Smith, then you are not going to go ahead and you're in no way means going to have the extra draft pick to trade away for Chase Claypool. So effectively, I think like trading Roquan was something that gave the Bears a lot more flexibility than people are willing to admit. And by the way, this clip's going viral on Twitter today, but someone asked Matt Eberflus today about how, hey, when you were in Indianapolis about 4 to 5 years ago, did you feel like Roquan Smith was going to be a fit then? Did you think that, you know, he was a player you wanted? And again, I think Flus came out and basically dodged the question, right? When in reality, if we're going to be fully honest, like Eberflus specifically said, like, look, I couldn't convince Chris Ballard enough to go ahead and draft a defensive player because the Colts were picking top 5 that year. The Bears were picking 8th. And again, Indianapolis did fine taking Quentin Nelson. The Bears did fine taking Roquan Smith because they got 4 to 5 years, you know, out of Roquan. But the reality is it's just like such a bizarre argument because a defensive coordinator rarely ever has a say in who the team's going to draft. Like, that's the head coach as well as the GM that are going ahead and making those moves and transactions.
Yeah, you make an interesting point with Eberflus' comments on that situation. You know, I think the quote you kind of summed it up well, but I mean, the quote kind of goes like, you know, I don't think Chris Ballard was in the mood to be convinced to pick an off-ball linebacker with where we were drafting. And, you know, like you say, it's a way to kind of dodge the question of, you know, whether he was a guy that was a fan of Roquan Smith, especially at that spot. But I also think it's kind of a subtle way of saying that, like, you know, when you're investing, you know, whether it's first round draft capital or salary cap space in, you know, players, you know, what are some of the positions that are valuable that you want to spend those premium resources on? And it's not off-ball linebacker. And I think that's a subtle way of saying that, like, you know, yeah, Roquan Smith, he's a very talented football player. He's done a lot of great stuff for the Bears, you know, two-time second-team All-Pro. Probably should have made a couple of Pro Bowls with the way he's played. He's consistently among the league leaders in tackles. He's an impact player in coverage. We know all the positive things that Roquan Smith does, but, you know, does an off-ball linebacker, does that position have the same value that an edge rusher does, that a corner does, as a wide receiver does? Does it have the same value that an offensive tackle does? And I think most people would say that no, it doesn't. Like linebacker to a degree is kind of like the running back position on the defensive side of the ball, where a lot of these guys, are replaceable. They don't make a ton of impact on the defense as a whole, and they're kind of reliant on the pieces around it because Roquan Smith is a player, like you said, probably a better fit in that 3-4 Fangio style of defense where he's a bit more protected by the defensive line, being able to, take on blocks and two-gap a little bit and allow him to run free sideline to sideline. Not the case here in, Matt Eberflus, more traditional 4-3 Tampa 2 scheme where it's more of a one-gap run defense where he's going to have to take on blockers in the run game and, can't rely on having big nose tackles eating up space. He can't rely on Eddie Goldman's and Akeem Hicks anymore to kind of take the blockers for him so that he can run around free and make tackles all over the field. That's not really the system that's the system he's designed for. He's not necessarily designed for this system where he's going to have to take on blockers at the line of scrimmage. And so you look at how that factors into it. Linebackers are very much a product of, the environment around them in terms of impacting a game. There are very few linebackers that impact a game consistently at a high enough level. I look at the Fred Warners, what he's able to do in San Francisco. Shaquille Leonard for the Colts. Obviously, Matt Eberflus coached him up over there. We've seen him have a pretty consistent impact. Bobby Wagner in his prime was able to do that. Not sure if he's that guy anymore. He's not that guy anymore, but Levante David maybe in his prime was that type of player. He's probably not at that stage anymore of his career. Maybe Eric Kendrick with the Vikings because of how good he is in coverage. But point being is there are very few linebackers that can impact a game consistently at a high enough level to be worthy of those high-end premium resources. When you look at a first-round pick or, tying up a bunch of cap space into them on big contract extensions. I think that's really the main takeaway here is that the Bears, whether it be Matt Eberflus, not seeing Roquan Smith being a fit for his system, or Ryan Poles just not thinking that it's wise to soak up so much cap space in, an off-ball linebacker when they're trying to rebuild this roster and, try to reinvest these resources into other premium positions, especially on hopefully the offensive side of the ball. What's the value in extending a guy like Roquan Smith? And I was always in the camp that if you weren't going to extend Roquan Smith this offseason, the only outcome, the only other move that you could do with him is to trade him at that point because, letting him walk in free agency for nothing isn't a wise strategy because you're not playing the comp pick game. You're just not. The Bears in this situation, they have to spend next offseason, so they're not in a position to just let him walk freely and pick up a comp pick for him. That's just not going to happen. And if you're going to play the franchise tag game and just go back and forth with it, like you're just stuck in the same situation that you were in this past offseason where Roquan Smith, he's going to demand top of the market linebacker money, and you're going to go back and forth on a contract situation. And it's just going to be another distraction for a team that's, trying to clean slate from the last regime and try to build a foundation moving forward. So you just can't have that sort of distraction for your organization just for an off-ball linebacker who, let's be honest, isn't going to be impacting a game. As good as Roquan Smith is, like we've seen it this year. There are many games where he's just not very impactful out there because of the nature of the position and also who he is as a player, not being the best at taking on blocks, not being a huge asset in run defense in this type of scheme where he has to take on blocks. That's just not his game. So again, I think there's a lot that goes into that, but I think you made another good point here and explained that because of this trade for Roquan Smith going to the Baltimore Ravens, it did open up the opportunity for the Bears to get aggressive here, giving them extra draft capital to make a move for adding an offensive weapon here. And that offensive weapon was Chase Claypool, like we said before. And like I said before, the Bears trading away their own second-round pick instead of the Baltimore Ravens second-round pick, presumably because the Packers were also offering a second-round pick for Chase Claypool, and the Bears had to kind of make their offer more enticing because, let's face it, Bears fans, like as bad as the Packers have been this year, the Bears are probably going to be a little bit worse record-wise than the Packers this year. So I thought that was a pretty interesting move. I'll start with your thoughts, Usayd, because I got into a bit of a firestorm on Twitter because of this. Because I made the point that I think this is pretty much an overpay for the Bears here, going after Chase Claypool with the second-round pick. I'll explain that moving forward. But what were your thoughts on the trade? Did you think this was an overpay, or do you think the value was just about right here with Claypool?
I mean, it's a bit of both, right? Like, you look at a player who kind of, when you look at the numbers, he's really only had, true wide receiver, like 3 production. And so naturally, when you kind of look at that, right, you're like, okay, well, this is one of those where, you get the receiver, right, that you need for Justin Fields, or at least something that's better than like Dante Pettis and Byron Pringle and certainly Velus Jones Jr., who's another point of discussion we'll be talking about at some point down the season if he doesn't get it together. But I think in general, right, like I would have been more content with giving up a third or a fourth, but the Steelers weren't going to do it. Now, I think people have to understand something. The Steelers offense is about as dysfunctional as it gets, right? You're talking about Claypool's rookie season where again, he popped off and I think he was on his way to becoming, one of the better younger emerging receivers in the league. But then you look at 2021, his sophomore season, and he really struggled simply because the quarterback was again worn down and it was clear it's time for Ben Roethlisberger to move on. And then you look at this year, and why is production down? Because they don't have an offensive line in Pittsburgh. Their running game suffering because they have no offensive line. They can't really play that old school brand of football. And then the old friend Mitch Trubisky throwing Chase Claypool the ball. You have George Pickens getting most of the attention. Deontay Johnson's getting some attention. So Chase kind of became the odd man out. Now, I ultimately look at this and I say that it's still a team-friendly deal from the sense that you do have a young wide receiver under control for another year and a half. And so, which bodes well for the Bears because, like, at this point, you don't need, like, a star Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase throwing in the passing game for Justin Fields. You don't need Justin Fields throwing to one of those guys. You're not going to get one of those guys at the trade deadline, but you can roll the dice on a low risk, high reward guy like Chase Claypool. And that's exactly what the Bears did here. So is it a move that, a lot of people think is going to pop off in a big way? Probably not. Does it add some stability for Justin and the offense moving forward? Yeah, and I will say, right, like this is Ryan Poles betting on himself. And he said it in his presser on, Tuesday afternoon. He's like, hey, if this fails, like I know for a fact it's on me, and I hate to break it to people, but like what you're seeing at Hallis Hall right now is not anything that Ryan Pace did. This is all the Ryan Poles show. And so when the 2023 offseason rolls around in another like 2 months, basically, I don't want to hear from people that like this is, give Ryan Poles a pass. Like, no, he's setting the Bears up for either success or failure. And he has to prove himself because the pressure's on him now more than anybody.
Yeah, Poles is definitely putting his stamp on this team now. I mean, we've seen it. He's moving off all the old regime guys. He's bringing in his own guys. And there's clearly a path here of how he wants to build his team next offseason. When it comes to the Claypool trade in general, though, I'll say this. Like, I'll say it again. Like, I think this was an overpay in terms of the draft compensation because I look at this. The Bears are probably giving up a top 40-ish pick here. I think their record isn't going to be great at the end of the year. Like, they've been competitive this year, but I think what we saw in the Cowboys game is going to be a little bit more of the norm moving forward, where I think this defense is going to struggle throughout the second half of this season because they trade away, some of their better players, and because I think they're going to be playing some better offenses as well. But if Justin Fields can continue to play like he has over these past few weeks, like that's fine because this offense is going to look a little bit more functional and you have something to build off of for next year. And I think Claypool definitely helps in that because, what has this receiving core missed? Obviously they're still missing that true number one alpha guy, right? And that's probably not something they can address, like you said, at the trade deadline here. It wasn't probably something they were going to address this offseason, given how everything has played out. But what they can do is kind of fill in the gaps of this wide receiver room right now. Mooney is more that number 2 wide receiver. I think Claypool ideally is more of a number 2 wide receiver. He's kind of been a number 3 for the Steelers over the past couple of years. But where Claypool kind of fits in this offense, the way I envision it is he's kind of that true X wide receiver on the boundary where he's going to be running those go balls, comebacks, back shoulders, in breaking routes on, deep digs and crossing routes where he can use his speed to his advantage, kind of be that, deep threat, jump ball guy, contested catch guy on the outside that this receiving core has really missed because, Equinemius St. Brown, he's had a nice year for, a guy who got picked up for a minimum contract, but he's definitely not that X wide receiver that can be a difference maker. And Claypool, while there are some, flaws in his game, for sure, which is one of the reasons why I think this is a bit of an overpay, he much better fits that X mold than anybody else on this roster. I mean, just look at his athletic profile. He's 6'4", he's 240 pounds. He can run a 4.340. Like, this dude's an athletic freak. So the Bears are kind of betting on the upside here, and they're betting on him kind of returning to the form that we saw of him in his rookie year, where he legitimately was really good, a really dynamic weapon for that Pittsburgh offense. Even though the stats looked fine in year two, like you said, it did kind of taper off for him a little bit in year two. He started to see some flaws in his game, but like you said, how can you really evaluate the guy as a player when he's playing with the corpse of Ben Roethlisberger, and then he's getting Mitch Trubisky and Kenny Pickett this year? Both guys are just not very good quarterbacks. And Matt Canada, his offense is a complete train wreck, by the way. Like, if you thought Matt Nagy was bad as an offensive coordinator, go look at a Pittsburgh Steelers game and watch the way that offense operates. Like, that is next level bad, the way they're operating there. They were using Chase Claypool actually as a slot weapon for them this year, and Claypool is just like, I just don't think he's the best fit as a slot receiver at this point in his career. But in terms of like the downsides of this trade, in terms of, what worries me a little bit, I shouldn't say worry me, but, concerns for if it were to go badly, why would this go badly for the Bears? You look at it, the Pittsburgh Steelers are the best organization in football at drafting, developing, and evaluating wide receivers, right? They're the gold standard in the NFL. Every single year, it seems like they're able to, or every couple of years, they're able to draft a gem at wide receiver. Like, getting at, I can list a bunch of names for the Steelers organization going back to all the way back to the 70s with how good they've been at evaluating that position. But for them to draft Chase Claypool and then quickly have him fall out of favor for that regime to the point where they were willing to draft 2 wide receivers in this past draft and then trade him this year in the third year of his contract when he's still relatively cheap and he's still young and he's still athletic and he's still, he was productive from a statistical standpoint last year. The fact that they were willing to do that kind of tells me that there may be something missing here with Claypool that maybe we're not seeing from him. There have been some rumblings of, just maturity issues maybe. I don't want to go too far into that because a lot of that is just what we're hearing in general and not something that I'm necessarily can say with 100% confidence in. But there's a scenario where there is something missing with Claypool and he doesn't live up to this. And again, when you're giving up a top 40 pick, like, that's a very valuable draft pick to give up for a guy who hasn't really lived up to his potential yet. So the Bears are kind of banking on him returning to his rookie form and capitalizing on his potential that he does have. Now, in terms of like why I don't think, even though it's an overpay, I still think it's a bad move. In fact, I think it's a pretty good move overall. Because the market for wide receivers right now is a bit inflated, and the market for Claypool is inflated because the Green Bay Packers and their desperation for a wide receiver kind of upping the draft pick compensation here for Claypool. But I will say, like, the Bears, when you look at the position they're in, like we mentioned before, like the Roquan Smith trade, getting an extra second-round pick from Baltimore allowed this deal to happen because now the Bears, they're giving up a top 40 pick probably, but they still have a second-round pick to work with here. It's not like they don't have anything in that second-round area, so they still have an ability to get a player here in the second round when we get to the draft next year. So it's not a complete loss there. And then when you're looking at the financial component of this, Claypool, I think his cap hits for next year is going to be like just above $1 million because the signing bonus is taken out of it. So you're getting a guy who's going to be here from a salary cap standpoint really cheap. And the wide receiver class next year in free agency isn't very good. We can talk about probably some of the rookies coming up for this wide receiver class and whether the Bears should invest in them as well moving forward. But because you overpay, I guess the one more negative before I finish on a positive note for this, but I guess one more negative here is that because the Bears have overpaid for Claypool, they're probably going to have to pay him an extension at the end of this year going into this offseason. And Claypool is probably going to ask for a lot here. And that's also going to raise the price for Darnell Mooney's contract extension, I would assume as well. So those are some of the negatives to kind of deal with. So those are some of the drawbacks of this deal. But what have we been saying all offseason? The Bears need to start investing on the offensive side of the ball. They need to start getting some weapons for Justin Fields. And because they are starting to do that, and they're starting to showcase some confidence in Justin Fields and his development, I don't mind this move whatsoever. I think it can work out for the Bears quite a bit. And I think this is a good situation for Claypool to kind of come in and develop here. I think this is a good scheme fit for him. So I'm cautiously excited about the prospects of Claypool here, even though I do think it's a bit of an overpay, like I said. And time will only tell how this pans out. But, the Bears completely reshaping this roster at the trade deadline here. A lot of players on the move, a lot of draft picks being exchanged here. So with all these trades in hindsight now, looking forward to the future here. Now we have to look forward to the 2023 draft and, how these trades impact the 2023 draft, because the Bears now, because of these trades, they have a first-round pick, the second-round pick via Baltimore now, a third-round pick, 2 fourth-round picks, 2 fifth-round picks, no sixth-round pick because they traded that away, I think, in the Jeremy Grant deal from last year. And then they have a seventh-round pick, and quite possibly they might be getting a seventh-round compensatory pick. I'm not sure if that's 100% verified or not, but that's potential as well. But they're at least having 1 seventh-round pick as well. So that's the draft situation for the Bears right now. So now that the dust is settled, Usayd, how do you think the trade deadline moves have impacted the Bears' draft plans for 2023, if at all?
Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is this, and let me take a step back. For next year, the Bears have picks in rounds 1, 2, and 3. They've got 2 fours. They've got 2 fifths, and then they've got a 7th-round pick, right? They don't have a 6th because, again, they acquired a 2023 6th-round pick when they traded Khalil Mack to the Chargers last year in March. And then what happened is they traded that same 2023 6th-round pick back to the Chargers during the 2022 NFL draft to have the rights to select at 254 and 255 overall in the 2022 NFL draft. But what it does is it moves your needs up and down the board, right? With all these extra trades, all these draft capitals. Now, if you were to ask me last week on Monday or Tuesday, hey, what are the Bears' biggest needs? I would have told you it's wide receiver and pass rusher, right? Going into the 2022 draft. And you could argue their offensive tackle too, because we don't really know if Braxton Jones is a surefire thing or not, right? So for me, what this ultimately comes down to is that you don't necessarily have to take a wide receiver in round 1 now. You could shift your focus to investing on defense, such as a Will Anderson, a Jim Carter, or a Brian Breezy, or you could go ahead and you could add someone to the offensive line. But with that said, you don't know how the draft board is going to shake out, right? And so if what happens is the fact that a blue chip player like a Jackson Smith-Njigba wide receiver from Ohio State, or someone like a Quentin Johnson wide receiver from TCU who's been on the rise, one of those guys starts slipping, then you absolutely pull the trigger. And 2 things. Number 1, you can never have enough wide receivers. And number 2, anytime there's a blue chip player like that, you go ahead and you make the move. I mean, take it back a couple of years, right? The 2020 NFL draft, you had Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, Jamar Chase was in that class, CeeDee Lamb too, I believe. And, CeeDee Lamb, let's be honest, like you and I remember doing that podcast, this same podcast that year, we were all projecting those names to kind of go within the top 10 picks. We thought there was going to be a big run on receivers and quarterbacks in the first round, followed by offensive tackles, right? But CD slipped all the way to the 17th overall pick. And at the time, you could have said that wide receiver wasn't necessarily a need for the Cowboys, but they went ahead and pulled the trigger on CeeDee Lamb, and I think it worked out really damn well for them. So it's one of those situations where it's like wide receivers not a major priority, but if the board falls in a way where a Smith-Njigba or a Quentin Johnson or a Jordan Addison start falling, then guess what? You continue investing in your quarterback and you draft one of those. You just draft a receiver in general, because people also have to keep something in mind, right? Is this just like, look at the Chiefs? They shipped out Tyreek Hill. They were content with McCole Hardman. They drafted Sky Moore, and then they went ahead and they basically flipped a third, I believe it was a 6th-round pick, to do what? Acquire Kadarius Toney. And why Kadarius Toney? Because Toney was at one point viewed as one of the future core players for the New York Giants, but he didn't mesh with the new regime. And so Andy Reid basically said, and Brett Veach, the GM, they're like, oh, this guy's Tyreek Hill 2.0, basically, right? May not be as dynamic of a playmaker, but he's certainly got the speed. Let's go out and let's add to our receiving corps. And they basically got him for pretty cheap.
Yeah, I'll touch on wide receiver in a little bit here, but in terms of like how other positions may be impacted by these trades, I'd say the edge rusher was always going to be a need for this team in general because, look at the state of this roster. Like, I don't think Robert Quinn fit into their future plans next year at all. I think he was going to get cut if he didn't get traded next year anyway. So he wasn't going to be around. You have Al-Qadim Muhammad going to the final year of his contract next year. And again, he's a role player. He's kind of just here to start the rebuild a little bit. You have some young guys like Trevis Gibson, Dominique Robinson on the roster who have flash, but I don't think you're counting on either of those guys being, true number one, alpha impact pass rushers for you off the edge. I just don't think you don't see them that way. If that does happen, like that'd be nice, but ideally those are guys that you factor in as rotational pieces for you moving forward, who can maybe be, low on starters, number 2 edge rushers for you off the edge, potentially if they develop the right way. But at the very least, they're rotational pieces for you. You still need that number 1 alpha edge rusher. And if that guy falls to you this draft, this is a pretty talented, edge rusher class, at least from what I've seen in the early scouting reports that I've seen so far, and from what I've seen personally watching some of the tape. So that's going to be a need for them at the top of this draft, I think, in the first or the second round, that they could invest in that edge rusher position. I think linebacker now becomes even more of a pressing need for this defense moving forward, because now next year you don't have any linebackers that you feel good about on this roster. And certainly Eberflus could look to invest in free agency to fill this void. His old guy from Indianapolis, Bobby Okereke, is going to be a free agent next year. I think that's probably going to be a guy that they target in free agency. And there are some other linebackers that are pretty solid as well in free agency that they could invest in. But, I'm excited to see, because Eberflus is a linebacker coach by trade. That's his background. So I'm excited to see what he has in mind for drafting a linebacker. And now the door is potentially opened up for him to draft a guy at day 2, maybe, with maybe some high-end athletic traits to kind of bring in and develop a little bit and see what he can do. A guy who fits better the mold that Eberflus wants in that linebacker room. So I think that certainly impacts this as well. But in general, I think this gives the Bears more ammo on day 3 to maybe move back, maybe move up a little bit to address some needs moving forward. And, it would have been nice to have 2 second-round picks, but now with Chase Claypool in the fold here at wide receiver, like you said, the wide receiver position, it's still a pretty significant need for this Bears team, but it isn't the glaring, desperate need here that it was looking like going into this offseason, where Darnell Mooney is still your only solidified guy in the roster. Phyllis Jones has proven nothing to you as a wide receiver as of yet, as a 3rd-round pick last year. And, man, this wide receiver class in free agency is not very good. Like, there are some slot options that I think could be solid. When I look at Jacoby Myers, Juju Smith-Schuster is a pretty solid slot option as well. Alan Lazard from the Packers, if Luke Gessie wants to bring him in as a guy he has a relationship with, but I'm not a huge Alan Lazard guy, to be honest, so that doesn't really get me excited. So the wide receiver options for the Bears in free agency aren't great next year. So Claypool is basically like a free agency signing that they can bring in. You're taking a swing there because you're not in love with your options in free agency. But I still think wide receiver should be, a pretty high priority for this team in the draft. Because, you brought up a good example with the Cowboys drafting CeeDee Lamb. Like, they had Amari Cooper on the roster. They had Michael Gallup on the roster. They had some other talented receivers on the roster as well when they drafted CeeDee Lamb. But it just goes to show that, you you never want to be in a position where you have too few weapons on your roster. I would rather have too many quality weapons on my roster than too few weapons, because when I have an abundance of weapons, it just makes life for my quarterback easier. And the only challenge then comes in, how do I balance the targets here to make sure that all these weapons can get involved in the offense? And I think if Luke Getsy is a good enough offensive coordinator, I think he can manage that. And if Justin Fields is a good enough quarterback, he'll be able to spread the ball around and get all these guys involved. So I think in the first round, wide receiver should still be a high priority. So if you feel good about a Quentin Johnston in the first round out of TCU, like I say take him. If you think Jackson Smith and Jimba can be that slot option for you to round out this receiving core, I say go ahead and take him in the first round. Jordan Addison can fill that role. If there's a first round value for a wide receiver that you really like, I say go for it and take the chance, because you can never have too many weapons. And it's about time that this organization start, investing in this team where the offense comes first instead of the defense. And I think, I was a little bit worried that this regime would, fall into the same tropes of Bears regimes in the past, where it would be defense first instead of offense first. But I'm glad to say that it seems like they're starting to get to the point where they're starting to reinvest these resources from the defense to the offensive side of the ball. And I hope that continues in this next year's draft with wide receiver. Like, I'd still be pretty disappointed if they don't draft a wide receiver high within the first 3 rounds of the draft next year. I'll say that, because it's still me moving forward. You never know what the contract situation is going to be for Mooney and Claypool. Like, one of those guys may have to leave in free agency when their contracts are up. And I would just like to have as many weapons as possible for Justin Fields. But hey, that's just me. That's just my brain talking there. But speaking of Justin Fields, let's get to previewing to end this podcast. This upcoming Bears game between them and the Dolphins at home here. So the Bears coming back home for this game after back-to-back games on the road. Usayd, I'll start with you. What's your prediction for this game? What are some of the storylines that you're looking out for, and who's your X factor for determining the outcome of this one?
Yeah, well, I think the X factor is the Bears secondary, right? You're facing Tyreek Hill as well as Jalen Waddle, as good as of a wide receiver duo that you're going to face all season. I think Tua Tagovailoa is kind of playing with a chip on his shoulder, especially with all the critics that have kind of come in and really criticized him. You look at Miami, I mean, they added Jeff Wilson. They also went ahead and they added Bradley Chubb. Now, whether or not Chubb ends up playing this weekend, I don't know, but the Dolphins are going all in on a championship this year because they believe, hey, this is our window, this is our time. We believe we can rise to the very top, right? So the reality is the major storylines for the Bears are going to revolve around what the defense is going to look like. But the Bears have made it very clear that this is not about Roquan Smith anymore. We're going to move ahead, and whoever's playing is going to play, which it actually bodes well for the Bears. Let me add on that Roquan Smith's not on the roster, because you do get these younger guys like a Jack Sanborn that are getting a chance at possibly starting, taking a crack at the starting lineup, getting those additional reps they would not have gotten. On the offensive side of the ball, it's going to be all about, hey, can Justin continue to put together strong performances? Because there's a couple things to keep in mind here, right? Number one, the argument that Justin's holding on to the ball too long is certainly valid. But also at the end of the day, the key thing to keep in mind is that he has to hold on to the ball too long because no one's getting open downfield, right? And he's trying to hope someone gets open, but then when no one gets open, he has to all of a sudden basically take off and use his legs more than you probably would like to think, right? So this game, I think, is going to be about, and we don't know yet if Chase Claypool is going to play, but this game is going to be more so about just continuing to get the passing offense underneath the feet of Justin Fields, because the reality is that the numbers may not show it, but the Bears are still a pretty run-heavy team. At the end of the day, though, they've started to kind of shift that offensive philosophy a bit more each week and say, hey, Justin, we're content with you throwing the ball more and more because we feel like this is allowing us to slowly turn you loose.
Yeah, I think we're in lockstep here for what the major storylines are in this game. I agree. I think the X factor is the secondary. The Dolphins have probably the most dynamic receiving core in football. When you look at Tyreek Hill, who's probably the best wide receiver in football right now, when you factor in just how dynamic his speed is and how impactful that is. Jalen Waddle's no slouch either. Like, Jalen Waddle's really good as a number 2 wide receiver. He'd be the best receiver in the Bears right now, that's for sure. And he's their secondary option. You have Mike Gesicki at tight end. And Mike McDaniel, the head coach of the Dolphins, has done a fantastic job here. And Tua, to his credit, is playing really well within the structure of this offense when he's been healthy and out there and distributing the ball to these playmakers, playing point guard, making good decisions. The offensive line for the Dolphins has been better this year with some of their additions there. And, that Mike McDaniel coming from that San Francisco system, he's going to have that run game going as well. But I think the key is going to be the secondary. Can they slow down Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? It's easier said than done. It's a really tough ask because those guys are just so unstoppable and they get open so easily. It's going to have to be a group effort. Not one guy is going to shut them down. They're going to have to work on it as a unit to really do a number on those guys. And if they don't, this game could get ugly quickly because those guys, if they get the ball in space, they have the ability to go from to take the ball and score from anywhere in the field. So that's just something to keep in mind with those playmakers there. On the offensive side of the ball, I am excited to see what the Bears do with Chase Claypool to incorporate him into the offense. I don't expect him to have a huge role in this game because he is going to be new to the playbook a little bit. So do they try to have a little bit of a package for him if he does play? Is he going to be a guy that they try to maybe do some gimmick plays with to kind of get him in rhythm a little bit? Those are some of the things I'm looking for. And then can Justin Fields continue to continue that momentum of the way he has played the last few weeks because he's played legitimately good these last couple of weeks. He's looking like he's improving. It looks like he's developing. He's getting more comfortable in this offense. So I want to continue to see him taking those steps forward. And if he can do so, I think regardless of the outcome of this game, it's going to be a positive step for this Bears rebuild moving forward this season. So to end this thing, Usayd, what's your prediction? What do you think the score is going to be for this one?
Yeah, I think the Bears end up losing 31-21. I say that because the defense not exactly top tier. I mean, it hasn't been top tier all season, but it's significantly taken a step back. And then I think that the Dolphins' offense is just too much to handle for Fields and the Bears to kind of keep pace with.
Yeah, I agree. I have the Bears losing 35-24 for many of the same points. Like, this Bears defense is not a good defense. Let's just be real here. Like, they benefited from playing some bad quarterbacks early in the year, but we saw against Dallas last week that when they play a good offense with competent quarterback play, this defense is going to struggle. We saw that against the Vikings when they played them, how this offense struggled. We saw that against the Packers for the most part in that game where this defense really struggled other than a couple of fluky mistakes that led to turnovers for the Packers, which was not caused by the Bears. But the Dolphins, they have one of the most dynamic offenses in football. Tua's playing well. They have these weapons. Mike McDaniel is an awesome offensive head coach, an awesome play caller. He's going to, have things dialed up that the Bears probably aren't going to be ready for. And it's probably going to be another game where the Bears, if they have a chance, they're going to have to win this game in a shootout, which is honestly something I'm looking forward to because we want to see Justin Fields sling the ball. We want to see this offense continue to open up a little bit. And I'm looking forward to that because I'll be at the game on Sunday. So I'm excited to go watch these guys live and really looking forward to this one here. But yeah, I have the Bears losing this one 35-24. I think it's going to be more of a high scoring game once again. But ultimately, the Bears just won't have enough bodies to stop this Dolphins offense and just not enough juice, even though they have improved on offense the last few weeks, just not enough juice on that side of the ball to keep this one competitive near the end. So those are our thoughts for the upcoming Bears-Dolphins game, and that's going to wrap it up for us here at Picks for Polls, recapping a wild trade deadline week here as this Bears roster just looks a lot different moving forward here for a variety of reasons. For all of our listeners here, thank you for tuning in to today's podcast, and I want you guys to make sure to subscribe to us here at the Bear Report and on Blue Wire Pods. Subscribe on all podcasting platforms for us here. Make sure to follow us on social media as well. You can follow the Bear Report on Twitter at Bear Report and Picks for Polls at Picks for Polls on Twitter. Usayd, where can our listeners follow you on social media and find your work.
Yeah, guys, you can follow me on social media at Usayd. Koshul, check out my work on the Bear Report as well.
Absolutely. Make sure to give Usayd a follow there. As for me, you can follow me on Twitter at AJFreeman25. You can also find my work at the Bear Report as well. And with that said, Bears fans, looking forward to another weekend of football here. The Bears team is a little bit different, but that doesn't mean our fandom is different here, as we're always looking for an exciting Sunday afternoon when it comes to these Bears games. And I'm looking forward to it personally. Going to be at the Bears game on Sunday. So with that said, I hope to see some of you guys there, Bears fans, at the game. And until next time, Bears fans, have a safe weekend. Have a fun weekend. Stay safe. And, of course, bear down.